Hello, everyone. It's Jerry at the Fledge. Welcome to another episode of Every Damn Day. And today on the show, we've got our great friend Brent Forsberg. How you doing today?
I am doing fantastic, and I got to tell you, I've been looking forward to this since you asked me a couple weeks ago.
I'm looking forward to it too. So let's jump right in. You want me to bring your slides up?
Yeah, and I want to ask you a question to get started. So, when you think about the individual person, us as humanity and down to the basics of who we are, and you boil down the idea of human need to one thing, one word, what's the first word that comes to your mind?
I think the first word that comes to mind as you're talking through that is like understanding my environment, understanding, if I should be fighting or running. From something as basic as that as to just trying to figure out what the hell I'm here for.
Yeah, that's a great one. Understanding definitely leads into what I do on a daily basis, especially in development, because creating that understanding of people is so important. First word that popped in my mind when I started thinking about this was the idea of fulfillment, our individual need to have that satisfaction. Whether you're looking at being part of a group, being in a religion, uh, getting down to the basic needs of food and shelter. It's all about that fulfillment, our need to keep moving forward. And I love your answer of understanding too. That fits so well in here. And when we look at that, it's important for me and as a developer, and what I'd like to do today, if it's all right, I know we've got the topic of understanding connected communities. I'd like to really kind of give the context behind how I think and how I perceive the operating system of our society and how I approach it in the development to create the idea of connectedness, if that's okay with you.
Sounds great. Is that a
Awesome.
good lead into your slides?
Yeah, that is a perfect. Thank you. So thank you for bringing that up. And it really starts and our off air. I love that you stated that you use this quote all the time too, because it's so important. And it leads into entrepreneurship. It leads into how we create things. And it's this idea that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we use to create them. And this quote, while ambiguous, also says so much because all entrepreneurship is changing the way of thinking of a new process or a new tool that we use to make ourselves feel more fulfilled. And it's the same thing when we're approaching connected communities as well, is this idea that we have to step back for a second and realize we've been building our communities one way for a long period of time and using one set of thinking. And if we really want to affect change in what we're doing, we have to readdress our approach to this. Uh, One gentleman that I follow a lot is a guy named Russell Acuff. He was a doctor, and he purported this idea that we're actually changing our age right now, that we're seeing a shift in how we actually interact with each other and in our environment. And we got a lot of things going on that I'd like to discuss that. I've built a few more slides to discuss to go over. But to understand that we have this shift in this idea of ages. And his argument was that we've moved now from the Renaissance age, where we began with the scientific method, the idea of creating an understanding and knowledge of all the individual pieces that make up who we are. We've increased our knowledge in our books and our understanding and technologies. That now we're moving into trying to create an understanding of how these relationships or interactions of all of these things that make up our society, our economy, our social networks, the technologies that we use, interact to create how we live and how we work with each other. And this is the basic of what we call systems thinking. So this systems thinking approach is what I use when I'm looking at how we interact with our communities, how we interact with our governance, and how we interact with our economy. And then as we build the places that we live, how those interact with all of those pieces, because that's how we get to where we're at. So this right here I want to show you is our universe. So it starts from all the way out from the Milky Way, going through our solar system, going to Earth, and understanding, going to a city, and all the way down to a human. So this is all of the systems going out to our universe that we interact with on a daily basis that all make up how we live here and all of the other people around us live when we look at society and all of the other plant and animal life that interact with us. So when we think about this, it's important that we got to step back and say, okay, it's not just about one policy that we're interacting. How is that going to affect all of the other pieces? And we'll cover a little bit of that in a few minutes.
So, a couple things real quick. I think it's and actually I don't know your slides and I forgot to memorize them. So I hope I'm not taking something away, but I think at the end of the day, everything we do is a system that we participate in. We're part of systems. We are a system. The Fledge is a system. The Fledge is part of a bigger system, and every system's a subsystem out to the infinite, at least. It's only the universe that encompasses every system, right?
Absolutely. No, you hit it right on the head, and that's how we have to approach, and that's how I approach development as a person and what I take into the company that I work with, because we have to get away from that understanding of the code of the house, the energy. We need to look at how is that system interacting with everything. And as society links more with technology, it makes our networks more complex. So as you can see with this graph, you have this kind of moving landscape. And what makes it hard for us is as we get hit with more technology and more things coming at us and our networks are bigger, things are moving faster, more complex. So it'd be like walking on this through the woods, where every time you take a step, it changes the landscape. You have to readjust everything that you do to take your next step. And there was a term in the 80s that came out for that called VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity in our environment. So we've moved, and as we are seeing a lot of what's happening in society right now, it does have to do with our system is making a fundamental change in how we're interacting with it, but then us reacting to it, trying to change and create and keep that understanding so we have that feeling of certainty within our systems.
I've been working on this probabilistic risk model for a long time, and it's only 2 dimensions, and I've been trying to add a 3rd, 4th, and 5th dimension. I think that VUCA is a hint there because I've been playing around with uncertainty a lot. This is cool. By the way, Bruce Lee and Giannis Jackson are both watching and have said hello to you.
Awesome. Well, hello guys, and appreciate you being on. It's great. What great people in our community.
Yeah. So sorry for the disruption.
Oh no, I love it. When we talk about this idea of complexity, it's so important because that level of uncertainty takes us out of something that makes us feel comfortable, and humans react to it in different ways. And it can begin to change our behavior. So when we talk about this and we're looking at it and we look at our systems, the systems have things that are called thresholds, and those get us to tipping points where we actually see a behavioral change in how we react with it. And we've seen a lot of them lately over the last few years. When we look at it, a stadium wave, for a very innocuous one, is a behavioral change. There's an input that goes in the system, whether it's a cheerleader or the Megatron that says do the wave, and one section begins it and it'll go. Or it might be a few students starting 3 or 4 the first time, 10 to 20 the next time, and then maybe the whole section, and all of a sudden, boom, it's going around the stadium. So it's an important thing to think about because it always starts at the very basic level. We always tend to govern from top down, but yet change is actually affected at the agent level, whatever that agent is. So in the case of the stadium wave, it's one individual that begins to trigger it, or a couple individuals that then change the behavior of the entire stadium. And we've seen it in society. A good one's happening right now with the Reddit investors. They're interrupting and changing the behaviors of our financial system in using where it was a few at first that all of a sudden changed the behaviors of a large, and we've hit a threshold there. We also saw it last year in a very serious sense when we saw what happened after George Floyd was killed. We saw a change in the behavior of how people were interacting with the cities and the society who were unhappy with this constant feeling of oppression. So these are some of these building blocks that we're looking at that change how we shift and how we interact with our society. So it's just important as we're looking at this and understanding as we build cities and want to create connections that these are the types of events that make the changes, whether good or bad, because it can go for the other way too if a policy changes and we can end up with discrimination and segregation in our societal models based on some change that happens.
Yeah.
So when we think about this, we've got another thing happening right now where we're seeing a shift with the pandemic. It's going to change our behaviors moving forward. So we call these black swan events, and we'll cover that a little bit too, where there's a quick change. And we've seen them in the past. The car, the automobile was a black swan event. It fundamentally changed how we live in our cities and how we transport ourselves within the communities that we live in. So another thing I want to talk before we get into some application of this is one more piece of the operating system of society. So we talked about how we have the behavior changes within the system, but let's look at how humanity exists in groups. It's based on one thing, this idea of trust. And this is from Franz de Waal in the book, The Bonobo and the Atheist. He does a great job of explaining this. The idea that it takes trust of us to have trust with other people around us to be able to live in these social groups. And that comes down to two fundamental pieces. One is reciprocity. And we form these groups for efficiency. So we have some people who are bread bakers, some people who are building our houses. So that way we don't have to do every single thing in society for us to live and feel fulfilled in life. We begin to specialize. And the other piece is empathy, that we have empathy with groups that begin to form around us. You know, throughout the ages, that was based a lot on geographic location. You had the small groups that you lived within because we didn't have ways to travel across the world. So you form these societal segmentations in there, and we got bigger as we made our cities. That in effect gave us better chances to interact and create new technologies. So that's how we got to where we're at. And then now we're moving one step further where we need to take this and move this into the idea of the understanding of our systems. So when we look at that, we can begin to understand how we begin to shape our environments. So we have two things that we're working with in here. We have the idea of our physical environment. So that is the geographic locations where we are. That's the things that we can touch, we can feel, that we're a part of. And within that, we have the natural environment, and we have the built environment that we create. That's our human habitat and the habitats for the animals and plants that we interact with. Then we have this idea of the metaphysical environment. And this is where we have created out of our minds these ideas of language, of the technology that we then manifest into the physical built environment. The idea of our constructed realities that we use to govern us, to look at from the idea of that individual fulfillment, how we manage society, everybody's little individual idea of fulfillment, to kind of balance those off each other to create a society that can work together to move forward and create fulfillment for the entire group. So for me, this is how I begin to look at how we came to our regional structures, our different governance that we follow. And when we look at that, we can add in the economic side of it, of the different eras that we've had. Everybody's familiar with this probably from school, the idea that we had the agricultural period of society, then we moved into the industrial age. And in 2002, it was said that we started to move into the knowledge area, right, where we saw the rise of these big businesses like Amazon and Uber and all these places that are on technology platforms. So now, we're somewhere in this as we look at that, we're moving to this conceptual age and changing how we think, and then looking at the eras that are changing. It happened in housing too. And this is something that I think is very important for us to understand. So this is a very Western perspective, by the way, when we're talking about housing and we're talking about how we've developed the United States. We start with this era in 1607 with the colonization of the United States. It started with the temporary extraction of resources here that then moved into permanent residence as people came here and were working to create wealth for Europe. And then we moved into this era that, okay, we're here in 1776, we're going to make this our own country. And excuse the oversimplification, but I just want to kind of explain this. We can go into depth of anything that seems worth talking about. To the Louisiana Purchase, to Manifest Destiny, to where we started clearing land and we had this expansionist period where we started mining the resources for ourselves and the wealth gain of the United States. We saw a collapse of that in 1930 with the Dust Bowl and the loss of the first Great Depression. That began the acceleration of urbanization. We were seeing kind of the mechanization of agriculture at the time. So people were moving in and the human resources were moving into the cities to start with manufacturing. And over that period, with World War II, we entered the era of decentralization, where housing was spread out and our industry was spread out because the technology and the black swan of the atomic bomb made it so we didn't want to put all of our resources in a very congested area. And that was a very simplification, but that was one of the reasons for governing to do that we wanted to spread things out so one area just couldn't be attacked and taken out. And that ended I'm arguing, in 2007 with the foreclosure boom. We saw the overheating of the market. We also saw the largest wealth transfer in the history of the United States as all those houses went into industrial, in large commercial portfolios and then were resold. And we started back saying, okay, we have this rise of the missing middle, where we started seeing diversity in housing begin to be promoted as we came out of the Great Recession. And we just hit a black swan event again, where we have this COVID that's going to change how we interact with our society. So is it the signal of another era, or is it just accelerating current trends? And that's one of the things that I study daily to try to understand where is this going and what does it do to housing and how we build our connected communities over the next 10 years.
All right.
So when we think about this, here's some of the policies that this begins to focus on. So when we take a look, I'm not going to go through all of these, but these really changed throughout the 20th century how we interact. And this gets into the 1948 public housing, or the GI Bill is what it was called, that subsidized the 30-year mortgage for single-family home. We had basically a moratorium go in on tenement-style housing that had been around for years. So we shifted because we wanted to shift where we were moving our populations. There's a lot of things we can unwrap in there that has to do with classism on economics, as the car was used to move people around the community. But for now, we're just going to take it that this is what happened when we went through and we saw this boom from 1950 up to the 1980s that made areas like mid-Michigan, where Lansing kind of spread out and became, the outlying communities that surrounded it. And it went through, started with the 60s with the Highway Act that gutted the city. What that did is it changed and limited our scale of growth. And we went to kind of the extremes where we had mid-rise or apartments in areas, or the larger towers that were all single-use, professional office towers, large industrial space out in the single-family home. We removed all of the stuff in the middle that we had built for centuries that people lived in, that allowed us to have these little bit more connected communities before the car was there, and we couldn't move as fast around the area. So what does that mean for an area like us? And this is something that really hit me years ago when we did this study. So on the left is a picture of Washington Avenue in the 1950s. If you take a look at that, there's no gaps inside that street. It's completely connected with commercial, with apartments up top. You've got a very vibrant downtown. The picture on the right, what do you think the red is, Jerry?
Well, I read it. It's parking.
It's parking. This is what we did to our downtowns with this idea. So then we wonder why our downtowns aren't vibrant. And this isn't just a Lansing problem. This is every metropolitan city in the country that, well, except for the big major ones, that land was too expensive to make that change. But you take any Midwestern city, this is what it looks like. Our land use is gutted. All of that, and when we talk about these issues that we have with funding and things, and taxation being how our cities thrive, but when you turn them into parking lots, they can't thrive because there's no real taxable value to that. And this is where we started getting into these funding issues starting in the 70s and moving forward.
So sorry, real quick. I've lived in communities where it felt a little bit connected. Like Ann Arbor, for example, living in an apartment above a store and stuff like that was always pretty cool. But there always was this big parking structures and parking problems. And I feel like Lansing is one of the worst. Is that true?
Lansing is very Midwestern for its size. It's average in that. Yeah, it definitely, compared to Ann Arbor, that has had, they're more constricted geographically with the rivers and the hills, and then they also put policies around there that, hey, growth is concentrated right here. We're not, then they built that green belt around them. So it forced that growth and forced the property values back up with policies. So it's a great juxtaposition against Lansing that just spread. And when I'm talking Lansing, I'm talking about greater Lansing. We went out because we had farmland that we could absorb and change versus staying constricted. And this policy was one of the biggest game changers and probably the most infamous, and I would argue the most damaging policy that came out of the 20th century was the securities and lending map. Have you heard the term redlining before?
I have, yes.
This is the map that redlining was based on, and this is Lansing. So when you look down the center of it, you can see the river. Those areas that were redlined or had the red boxes were areas where banks would not loan money. And generally what that meant was that it had a higher than a few percent population of minorities in it. And that was shot down by the government. So then it became risk based on value. So, they took segregation and changed the word to neighborhood value. So that therefore it was kind of overlooked. So when we take a look at how this affects Lansing, I want to take a look specifically over by Sexton High School, this little green box that's kind of on the far left side of the screen. And we're going to go in and just see what's going on today over there. So when we talk about this was an area that was in the green, which meant it was available for funding back then. This neighborhood is still 70% white and 30% minority. Median income is $56,000. Median household value, and this is a couple of years old, is 82. It's jumped up significantly in the last few years. Unemployment's 11%. Poverty rate is 3.98%. This is significant because Lansing's poverty rate is over 25% right now. So this neighborhood, because it was able to have money from 1934 to constantly be reinvested, has stayed a very viable neighborhood. Let's look what happened when we ran the highway through. So this was one of the few areas where minorities, when the highway came through, could easily get a house. So we have this kind of flip where it's now 70% minority, 30% white, but we still have great trends because we still have below poverty at 8%. We have median household income of 57,000. 58,000 almost, because this area still throughout that whole period was able to get loans and money to be able to stay stable. Jump across the street to the Red Line district. So this is the other side of the highway. We have a median household income of 20,000. We have a poverty rate of 36%. We have still low unemployment at 3.8%. But when you look at what they're making to live there, that $20,000 a year, that neighborhood has had a hard time, and it's never gotten the money to be able to grow with the rest of the city. And we have other pockets like this. And nationwide, 75% of the red line districts are still in poverty today. A lot of the other ones were just wiped out by the highways. So it's significant when we talk about how these policies and these relationships, when we get into systems thinking, that these are the things that we have to unravel when we're talking about how we build the systems of connectivity and are careful about the policies that we enact in the future. And I threw this in because it was very important. This was a project done that talks about the urban renewal and a lot of the individual stories of the people who were displaced for the highway. So this link, make sure if we can get it in the show notes, that would be great so people can look at that. It talks about our history and the effects on people that lived it.
So, I don't know how far we are in your slides. Are we going to touch on gentrification at all?
We can, and this might be a good lead into it. So there's only a couple slides left on the presentation, but one thing that we understand is And I love this quote from Frank Lloyd Wright that said, first and foremost, a city is not an arrangement of roads, building, and spaces. It's a society in action, and it's a process rather than a form. So in understanding this, that we can shape our own realities in this, using the emotional engagement, our action, our imagination, we get into the idea of gentrification. This is something that we have to be very aware of when we're looking at our growth patterns and understanding how we grow our neighborhoods. And this is where inclusion becomes extremely important, because when we're looking at it, we want to look at the criteria of how do we make these areas inclusive, because gentrification, the definition of it is the displacement of a socioeconomic level in a neighborhood, or that as it goes up in value, that people that live there that may be in poverty can't afford to stay there. And when we talk about inclusive neighborhoods, what's important is that we actually understand that we have to create the environment for the people that are currently living in some of the, especially these red line districts, of access to education, access to training for jobs, access to money to allow their house values to go up, not to displace people, but to actually have viable, suitable housing. Because when we talk about affordability in housing, Lansing especially, there's no shortage of affordable housing. But what we have a shortage of is houses that aren't functionally obsolete. You know, I think our average house across the city is built in 1964. I could be wrong on that quote, but it's old. It's the point that most of our stuff is from that post-World War II growth pattern, and it really hasn't changed that much. But those houses can also be incrementally changed and have amenities added to them that can help. And then when we get into understanding, connecting these neighborhoods, making these connections with our schools, with our trades, with all of these other networks that we have, that we've built around us, like exactly what you're doing at the Fledge. Entrepreneurship is an important piece of this, that we create the neighborhoods that allow every socioeconomic level to benefit and not just push people out.
See, this is really where I wanted to talk about. I mean, I'm sorry, not for the whole show, but why I was asking that gentrification question is because we can have housing that improves and that does become a little more expensive, but we're missing all the other things that are in the system too, right? And I love that. I love your response to that, because we're not trying to just raise values and push out a bunch of Black and brown people. We're trying to make better communities, better neighborhoods that give that opportunity to prosper to everybody in that neighborhood. Is that a fair summary of what you're kind of saying?
That is a more than fair summary. That's the perfect summary to what I'm trying to say. That when we look at this and we understand, and that's understanding the people that live there, what are their needs? You know, and that's one of the things that's very important for me to understand, because we hear a lot about this idea of white savior, right? And being a developer, this is something that we have to be very cognizant of, that I have ideas for growth and neighborhoods, but that isn't necessarily what the people that live there want or need. And that's not for me to decide. What's for me to decide is to help create those networks or access to networks to help them fulfill their needs. And this is what it gets down to, is understanding what the behavior and needs of both the microculture of an individual street or neighborhood up to how it fits into our entire region and these different systems, and understanding all of these aspects of the cultures, and then coming in and saying, you know, passing somebody on to the Fledge saying, oh, you want to be an entrepreneur? Call Jerry. That's not my what I'm good at. What I'm good at is entitlements and getting projects ready to go. So it's using our network and using these connections that we have. And the one thing I love about the Lansing region is it's a very small, big city. So being able to make these connections, we are at a real advantage. And I think moving forward for the next 10 to 15 years is going to be our competitive advantage. You know, when we look at where people want to live, we got a river through our town that people are kayaking on daily. We have jobs diversity. We have a great ecology for startup businesses. We have university research. We have such advantages here that is going to insulate us for the next 20 years where now post-COVID, this idea that we're not that dense, this is a place people are going to want to live. This is a place that offers that benefit where you can have our local restaurants and the art connections that we have here and the entertainment, but you're still only 90 minutes from the Detroit Institute of Art to see, international works of art that are amazing. And yet our local culture is amazing with Scrap Fest and, hashtag 517 and all the other things that you're doing over there at the Fledge with the different events, once we're outside of COVID, from the Friday night events to some of the big things for entrepreneurship. This is what the connected community is, and that's why I'm excited about Lansing as a region.
Do you consider yourself a developer? Is that what you call yourself? Is that
so? That's my job title, which is funny because sometimes I say that, and a kid will ask me what platform I'm on, and I have no clue what that even means. So,
just tell them Python.
Python, that's the one that I started learning. I actually bought a book to just at least understand what Python is for another project that I'm working on. But a developer is technically what my job is, but really my job is creating connections. And how I look at it is it's about building spaces that people want to interact with. We call it place-based development. So placemaking is the idea of having spaces that people want to spend time in. Place-based development is stepping one step back and looking at the infrastructure behind it, the scale, the design, the connections with technology, the connections with individual people, the connections with the job. So to be a successful developer, for me, it's understanding all of those pieces, because looking at it from a business standpoint, buildings traditionally follow a blight cycle. We hear this in neighborhoods, and it's just unfortunately accepted fact that neighborhoods go through cycles, right? We have a growth cycle where they start up, and then they go through this age of exponential growth, and we get to maturation. And each one of those, when you're learning this stuff in policy and reading books, that everybody says they've got this just set, right? And then once you get to maturation, that's where you get your big box stores and things in. An area homogenizes, then you have a shift maybe in jobs where jobs get lost. You go into the blight cycle, decline, then you wipe the neighborhood out after a generation and you restart the build again. So my argument is, if we can understand these connections, why can't we be like some of the neighborhoods in Boston, some of the neighborhoods in New York that had avoided those areas of the true blight down cycle, where we can actually create a longer growth cycle and just deal with the minor blips. So it's more about moving the volatility out of the life cycle of a building for me and moving it into long-term multi-generational life cycles of how we live and creating these vibrant communities.
So the reason I ask you if you considered yourself a developer is because I always see you as more than that. You're thinking different, you're thinking bigger, and you're also the only developer, I'll stick with that word, who's ever called me and asked me my opinion about something in this community. And I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. And that's the approach that we started taking years ago, because I'm not going to live and I'm not going to work everywhere I build something. For me, it's about what are the neighbors and the people that are going to have to interact with this on a daily basis, what do they think about it? And we made this switch years and years ago, and it's something that my grandfather and father both started with when they did single family homes in the 60s and 70s, was putting parks in, because they wanted places where people could relax close to where their houses were. And it's just building on that philosophy more, where when we're working in neighborhoods, and we're especially neighborhoods that have established culture, I can make or break that with how we do the design of a front of a building. So let's look at a couple examples in Lansing. So take the Lottery Building downtown on Washington Avenue. There is not a single door facing Washington Avenue, which was the commercial corridor I showed the picture of, that has destroyed the walkability of that side of the street till that building gets taken down, which is going to be 50 to 75 years minimum from when it was constructed. So when we take a look at this and understanding from a developer standpoint, it's so important that we look at how is the neighborhood, how are the people moving within the neighborhood, what are the things that they want? And this is what we call our intended outcomes. And it does start very much, as we talk with systems thinking, it starts at the agent level. The agent for me is the individual living in the houses in those neighborhoods, the individual working in those businesses that are there every day. So when I'm looking at change as a developer, I'm looking at it that I want the input starting at that level, because we want to create changes for behavior and how those neighborhoods are that enhance the culture that they want in the neighborhood, they being the people that live there, both locally and regionally, depending on the scale of what we're building. So that's why you've received phone calls from me, because that input is critical to understanding that.
Yeah. So should our jobs be in this neighborhood, or are they, because they're maybe a block up on Michigan Avenue? And should jobs be close to where we live?
It depends on what you want for the intended outcome for that neighborhood. So if you take an area that's very mixed use and you're creating those sense of a place, it's going to be different neighborhood to neighborhood. So some neighborhoods are going to say yes. And for me, I like the idea of Andre Duani's 10-minute neighborhood, where you can walk to your job, restaurants, everything that you need to live within 10 minutes. And that's great. And especially when you get to an urban environment, that's so important, because this is how we cut down on carbon emissions. This is how we conserve our resources. Think about this when we look at a road. I live in a single family neighborhood in Meridian Township. The road in front of me is supported by $450 of my taxes. That doesn't cover the maintenance and the plowing yearly it takes just to move the snow. But yet that dollar has to stretch across all the roads in Ingham County, and so do everybody else's. And it's a single-use road. I mean, it's only used while I'm here because it's just for living. Now, let's take an area like downtown Lansing. If you have mixed use, now you're spreading those tax dollars to the people that live there and work there, and now you have a 24-hour system around those resources, which is why this is so important. As we look at allocation of our resources, our energy, the materials that we're mining from the earth to create the pipes that are sanitary sewer and our water pipes, we need to use those to the most efficient way possible. And when we're in an urban environment, that means multiplying the uses that we can spread that infrastructure over time, because we have more money to pay for them and we're using less of the resources because they're at a fuller utilization throughout the course of a 24-hour period. So if you're going out to rural somewhere where some people might live, then it might be conservation of resources by limiting the amount of houses out there and what we're extracting of water and the sewer and things and the septics that we're putting in, because that's going to be a different model. You don't necessarily want businesses there because you want them in an area where more people can have access to them. So that's about talking through what you want your growth patterns to be, both on a hyper-local level out to the regional structure of our community.
One more quick kind of systems thing. I look around the neighborhood here, and about 50% of the homes are owned by the people that live in them, and the other 50% are rentals. And then of those rentals, there's a lot of churn. How do you get that community input if so many people? Is it from the homeowner itself that's renting it out, or how do you get that what we want, or do we have to change home ownership?
So 50-50 isn't a bad split. So my question would be on the churn. Why do people want to leave? And this is where we get into systems-based thinking.
I'm having
Am I back?
Yes, you are.
All right. So this is where
you never really left.
Okay. The question for me would be, why do people want to leave those neighborhoods? Because that's where the questioning should start. What is it that's causing them to move in there for a short period of time, then leave? Is it the quality of housing? Is it missing access to something? So the conversation begins with the more transient folks that if we're leaving this neighborhood, what is it that's causing that pain for you to pick up stakes and move again? And that's where we begin looking at the relationships. Then we can go back into the overall neighborhood mix. Is it because the housing is dilapidated? If the housing's functionally obsolete, look, I moved in and I can see my breath in the middle of the night in the winter, and I just don't want to pay the $400 electric bill because the house doesn't have it. Then we look at resources to help with the housing. Is it the fact that, look, we're just MSU students, this is a cheap place for us to live, so we're here quietly for a couple years and we're moving on? Maybe that's the answer. So maybe it's just about engaging them so they want to stay after they're done. That, look, this is a cool neighborhood. Here's the things going on. We want you to live here for another year or two. Actually, we don't want you to leave at all. We want you to put your roots down here, get a job, and stay in our neighborhood, and let's make it fun for a long period of time. So it's beginning to make those understandings for me in that systems-based thinking.
Maybe it's because some jackass bought a big old church and had a bunch of rap shows.
Maybe it's a bunch of rap shows.
All right. Thank you. This is good. So I'll let you get back to your flow. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
Oh, no, this is great. And that was, I've covered, this is the last slide that I had that just, talks about creating that sense of place where people want to belong, because that's how we make roots get put in place. And this is how we build those emotional connections. And those emotional connections are what keep people where they're at. And it starts with everything that we talked about on the systems thinking. And I just put in a few books that I've read that help kind of shift my thinking and understanding on this.
I like it. I want to talk to you about one more thing. I've always had this dream of Eureka. If you go to like say Austin, and Austin's got 6th Street and 5th Street, and 6th Street's kind of their busy street, and 5th is kind of their warehouse district. I've always thought Eureka would be cool to have a mix of, here's a little shop on the bottom of the house, and the people live upstairs, and just walking down Eureka from Sparrow to, all the way down to, let's just say, the Avenue or something like that. Just seems like that would be a good place to live, to have all these little things that we could go and do right here on this street. And zoning would prohibit that immediately, I think.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Zoning, absolutely, especially in that neighborhood where it's all single family zoning. Which is one of the areas in Lansing where that's in place. And you're seeing areas like Austin and even Houston that are getting rid of zoning laws altogether. I am not a fan of zoning. I understand that we need some sort of governance for use restrictions in certain areas, especially when we get into environmentally sensitive. But it does change how we live. When those neighborhoods were first started, I'm going to use Baker Street as an example. If you go down Baker Street near the railroad tracks between Penn and Cedar, there was a small little neighborhood commercial center I think there's still a store there. I think it closed with COVID, but there's another commercial building right across the street. This was our neighborhood patterns for years, where you had that commercial built right into the neighborhoods that you could walk to. And we decided and we being our government decided post-World War II, that was no longer a viable strategy, that we're going to put everything in their little self-contained box to make it easy for us to understand. And that's something that neighborhoods have to decide. If you want that commercial, you want that experience, then it's the Jane Jacobs model. We're getting enough people together to go in and lobby, say, hey, this is what we want our neighborhood to look like. And that's where the conversations begin. This is a messy process. And it's, because there's going to be people that don't want it at all, and there's going to be others that are fighting for it tooth and nail. And it's constantly creating that balance of what those should look like. And understanding that in urban neighborhoods, there's probably going to be more incremental density than there is in suburban versus rural. So, and looking at what the scale is and design for those neighborhoods that people live in. And maybe enough people on Eureka say it's not good, but maybe, I'll just pick a street. Foster says, come on, bring it, let's do it. So that becomes the street, or it's maybe a few blocks over somewhere else. So it's about that conversation and understanding, where do we want to be in 10 years? Patrick Geddes is somebody that was the first person to really understand in modern society in the late 1800s, early 1900s of what regionalism was. And he said that we are a product of our last 50 years of decisions. And here's the thing, you and I are never going to live in what we think the perfect neighborhood mix should be. All we can do is point the needle a little bit further along for the next generation. They're going to live 50 years from now based on the decisions that you and I make today that help them have that better experience. And we're living off the decisions of post-World War II decentralization. And we still have tons of great neighborhoods and tons of culture, but it did change those patterns of connection. So for me, it's about affecting that.
In the 30s and 40s, maybe in the 50s too, Norris Grocery was on Olds Avenue. I think really close to that redlining zone that you were showing before from the west side. And that was my grandfather's father and his brothers and my uncles and all these. That was our grocery store. And I still dream of that. And you're spot on. It looked just like that building that's across from the party store that you're talking about. And maybe I just yearn for that. And then the other thing, go ahead.
Oh, no, but, and it's not just, I mean, this was the scale before we had zoning, before we had government telling us what loans the banks could do. That's what the banks were loaning on. And this is what we built as individual humans. We were building things that we wanted. So it has something to do with how we create our own habitats. Go back to any of the markets in the old worlds and take a look at. They're scaled. They're 2-3 stories tops, up to 6 in high dense areas, because that's the farthest people were willing to walk without having the elevator. So pre-elevator, 6 stories was maximum. And when we look at that, that is without the top down telling us how to do things. We're going bottom up. We build. So that's in our DNA of how we want to live. So the smile that you just cracked on your face when you're thinking of it is very much what people have when they're in those neighborhoods, and why we don't keep creating those. But yet, let's just take a quick look at something really fast policy-wise. So when I build a multifamily apartment building, I can get a 30-year mortgage from FHA back that goes non-recourse. Why is non-recourse important? Because I can pull that off my balance sheet once it's fully stabilized, and I can recycle the money or my ability to get loans to build another development. If you do a mixed-use building, you're best going to get a 60-40 loan. You're going to get a 20-year AM at the very best with a 5-year ARM, which means that you have to refi that every 5 years. And you have to carry it on a personal guarantee, which means your balance sheet's tied up, and you can no longer build anything else, because that's what the government said they're willing to fund. So when we look at this, these policies absolutely affect how these neighborhood grows, and it's very intentional. And this is something that we have to look at, and that I'm trying to work on a larger scale of how do we adjust these policies and change the risk mitigation models to say, hey, banks, this is actually a safer investment, because over a 20-year period, this neighborhood is going to have more utilization of that space than the big box that went dark after 15 years.
Oh, it'll be a self-storage or something, won't it?
Yeah.
Jesus. All right. So one more thing, because I'm really digging this, like these little subtle things that change the whole dynamic. I talked to Pat Linderman a lot about the history of Lansing and the houses, and he likes the story about the big porches that were in the front of the houses until the 60s and 70s. And then all of a sudden those started to disappear in the big fences, and you had your work buddies over. You didn't have your neighbors over anymore, and people weren't waving and saying hello and barely know each other. Any comments on that?
Absolutely. So let's think about what was happening at that time. So when we look at when the front porch disappeared, and we take a look at the age of housing pre the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that's when we started running public sewer. So before that, you had an outhouse in your backyard, so you had everything pushed towards the front because you really didn't want to spend a whole lot of time, especially in the summer, near that outhouse. So the idea of the porch going away was to say, look, you can now utilize this green space in your backyard, not as your septic field, but you can have your buddies over and have your own private garden space. which even spreads out one step further. That goes back to actually Versailles in France, of the idea of the grass and things that we use for ornamental, for walking on to create those parks versus having an actual garden that was for food sustenance because you didn't need it. So all of these things and all of these changes in technology have changed how we've done the house. So throughout the idea of the growth post World War II, showing that you had a modern garage and you didn't have the front porch was to say, look, this is modern design. This is a new product, and people love shiny and new. It's just who we are. So that was one of the things that came out of why there's change in what we saw in the porches.
So the backyard with the outhouse, that's why the Victory Gardens were in the front yard?
Yeah.
All right.
On some of the older stuff. Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, in 1940, there was still, I think, over 30 to 40% of the houses in the country didn't have modern plumbing.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that. That's not that long ago. And, you know, we talk about electricity, and when you look at this idea of modern housing, you know, this is less than 100 years old. I mean, even in the 20s, we were still building houses out of hay and sod that were just temporary domiciles for people to live in.
Mm. So we'll talk a little bit more, but I'm at the every damn day part. And
Yeah.
earlier you said, you know, nudging that needle in the direction that you want. You might not see it, but where you think it should be in 50 years. What's something you do every damn day to nudge that needle?
So, something that I do every day to nudge that needle, and I didn't have this set up before we talked, but I can show you right here. So just off screen right now, this is what's next to me.
Ah, all right.
Is studying. I mean, I try to spend at least a couple hours a day. So some of the things right now, understanding the spatial economy, looking at the idea of agglomeration, which is when we get in groups and scale, how society moves faster. Location and land use theory from 40 years ago, just to understand the historical context in real time from the people that wrote it, saying that this is the newest and greatest thing. So Triumph of the City, looking at some of the formulas that Dr. Edward Glaser and others are using to understand how our growth models built. The Cooking Gene. This book I would recommend for everybody to read. It's a young gentleman, African-American from the South, Michael Twitty, who was using food to understand his roots to slavery and also back to the home countries, not just the African roots, but also the European roots that were 25% of his DNA from back in slave time. And it's really interesting in how he builds those connections and then the nuances of how he understands the racial divide. And it's gut-wrenching at points. And then Uneven Ground, understanding land use policy with the Native American sovereignty laws. And, you know, we just saw a huge monumental case a few months ago where almost half of Oklahoma was put back under indigenous people rule for governance. And there's a lot of areas in Michigan that are facing the same thing. Harbor Springs, that land was never ceded by treaty. It was just kind of taken over. So you're going to see these cases of land use just become so important as we try to swing the pendulum back from just European colonialization to understanding what the United States is as a society moving forward now. So, and then missing middle housing. Another one that's important, our friend, you know, back in school, I remember the speeches, you know, from Dr. Seuss was one of those first things they teach you about anti-racism, the stars, right? Well, what we don't understand was Dr. Seuss pre-1960s was very politicized in understanding the war effort. So very anti-Japanese and very anti-German, and really did a lot of damage with characterization of people and what we get when we get to the stereotypes and understanding that. And that's important because as we look at connected society, to be able to understand the language that creates the level of enmity between us, because it ranges from just the idea of derogatory language to, you know, putting somebody down, that person's stupid, it moves up to that next level of all insert ethnicity, neighborhood, economic class here are, all the way up to where we get to subjugation and oppression, and understanding how we move throughout that and ebb and flow in society, because that social context plays so much into our neighborhoods and how we interact with each other. So every damn day, I'm sitting here reading journals and going through Harvard Review, going to JSTOR online to pull up old articles and go all the way back to understanding Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, to William Godwin and the idea of philosophical governance, up to today looking at current laws and understanding of how these policies are going to play out as we try to create models of understanding for what the next 10, 20, 30 years look like.
And I bet you stand in front of that whiteboard a lot too.
That is, I've got one here and then a bigger one at my other office, yes, and constantly writing stuff out.
Yeah. So we daisy chain the shows together. And yesterday on the show, I had a young artist, Danielle Smith, and she wanted me to pass a question to you that is, what are you grateful for that came out of 2020?
So I am a very driven person, and I've had a few people tell me that I'm not a very patient person. Yeah, I want things done now, and I want everything to happen now. And the one thing that 2020 did, especially going into the summer with the shutdown and construction being shut down in the fall, in the spring, was having that moment to kind of reset and think, do I really, is pushing that hard actually beneficial to the overall outcomes of what I'm doing? And it also gave me a lot of time. I mean, I jumped in with the kids and we social distance up north and went camping and doing those type of things, and really taking that time to realize, look, I'm never going to have another moment like this, most likely. I hope not in my lifetime, where everything's just put on hold. So to be able to benefit on that and kind of step back for a minute was what I was very grateful for coming out of it, because it did give a good, instead of having to have a midlife crisis, I just got a midlife reset, thanks to us having to distance from each other and lose those connections, which for me were mainly work-based, because constantly trying to push these ideas forward, to step back and say, nope, I can just relax and just take a few minutes and a few weeks to just sit back. So for me, that was the biggest takeaway, and something that I'll be grateful for the rest of my life, that no matter what happens, I had that time to do that.
Yeah,
so
I like it. So tomorrow on the show, I've got Chris Knapp. I think you must have run across him a few times, I'm sure, over the years.
Yeah.
And he runs Accessiversity, and he's legally blind, and we're going to be talking about accessibility for the most part. What would you like to ask him?
Boy, I love that question of what are we grateful for? So I think for going with the question, just understanding what is it that he's grateful for, and what brings him maybe happiness in what's in his life. What is it, that joy, motivation that he's grateful for in his life? So
I like it. You take a tool away from me, because I usually ask you that same question. What, happy, that word, it's in my mission to create opportunity to pursue happiness. Nobody has the same definition of it. I mean, I rarely find that. What do you think is going to make you happy in 2021? I'll flip the question a bit.
Yeah. So for me, happiness is a very intended outcome too. So, and my idea of happiness is that emotional state from when we do an activity or something that creates that sense of fulfillment on a small level. So I take a look at it that for me, it's actually getting to this idea of joy and not letting everything rattle me that is around. You're just staying focused on, I know where I want to take my career and how I can create the largest impact to society as a whole, of putting together these ideas that I've been working on that other people can study and build on in the future. So the happiness for me is constantly getting up every day to have that sense of fulfillment that then creates the joy that we have to stay in mentally, because it's so easy with all the negativity that's pushed on us daily. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I'm not perfect at this in any way, shape, or form, and it's a constant battle, because I have a lot of passion, so therefore it can range from anger to happiness to everything in between, right? So it's just constantly balancing that and understanding that as long as I move forward, and when I wake up and that day and say, okay, no matter what happened the day before, I'm going to move one step further. And if I can go to bed and say, you know what, I don't care if it was an inch, I don't care if it was a millimeter, if it's one more little piece of knowledge, one person that says, wow, I thank you for the connection over there, or a kid saying, oh, that's really cool, or thanks for the help at sports. I mean, being involved in all of it. For me, that's what it is it's creating that sense of fulfillment. I put together a statement a while ago, and it's to provide a sense of belonging so that others can feel empowered in their self-determined future. And for me, it's the idea that belonging empowers people. And that's what brings me joy and is my daily motivation for getting up, and what made kind of this beginning of COVID so hard, because I feed so much off of other people. I don't do good just kind of sitting alone by myself. And it was a real adaptation on these screens. Like, this interaction is great, but there's been times like at different meetings and stuff where you're just talking to a screen with no interaction from anybody else. And for me, that was hard to adapt to, but it's that belonging empowers people is my happiness.
Well, let me throw some more interaction up. Bruce, your mentee from the One and All program, and he raved about you all the time. I mean, he really did. Sorry, Bruce, if I'm out and you're trying to be all tough with your friend and all. But Bruce is a great guy too. But
oh my goodness.
He said, what a pleasure to watch this and to learn something. So, I love talking to you. I always have. We've had conversations in boardrooms and in bars. And
yes.
I always think it's fascinating. And, there's a lot of developers around, a lot of development around, and, the city, the people in our neighborhood, we don't always agree with it. And I love this explanation and this understanding, and I feel a little more empowered to help figure out what the community does want. So thank you so very, very much for that.
Well, thank you for having me on, and you are empowered, and that's one thing that everybody, if there's one takeaway on this video, is each of us are empowered to create this understanding and have a say in what our communities look like. And it's the conversations. This is what creates this emotional connection, and this is what a connected community is. It's everybody understanding they are empowered of what their future is going to be.
I usually ask you to take us out with something. I think you just nailed it.
I'll stick with that.
All right. So everyone, stay tuned for another episode of Every Damn Day. Tomorrow we'll have Chris Knapp, and we'll be talking about accessibility, and we're going to make a change that will last for the rest of the shows that we do. And I will see you later. See you, Brent.
Goodbye. Thank you.